The story of the Whittakers begins not with fame, not with film crews, but with silence, the kind that hangs heavy in the hills of rural West Virginia. Long before they were a name recognized by millions, before documentaries and YouTube thumbnails turned them into a cultural fascination, the Whittaker family lived a life that few could truly understand and even fewer could imagine. Their home sat deep in the Appalachian folds of West Virginia, a small, weather-beaten house surrounded by fields, barking dogs, and generations of history. From the outside, it was just another old family home in a forgotten part of the country. But inside, it held a story that would one day captivate and divide the entire world. When filmmaker Mark Lyda first introduced the Whittakers through his Soft White Underbelly series, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Millions of people tuned in. Some were fascinated, some were horrified, some were moved to tears, and others were simply curious about what they were seeing, a family living far outside what society would call normal. The World Meets the Whittakers. The video that changed everything featured three siblings, Lorraine, Ray, and Timmy, sitting on a porch filled with worn chairs and stray animals. Their unique speech patterns, repetitive gestures, and visible confusion painted a picture that viewers couldn't look away from. The world suddenly knew their names, and with it came the question that echoed across the internet. Who are the Whittakers? For some, it was a story of poverty. For others, a story of neglect. But to the millions who watched, it became something deeper, a reflection of human resilience and the consequences of isolation. Ray, often called Ray, quickly became one of the most recognizable figures in the family. His barking like vocalizations drew attention and misunderstanding in equal measure. Many didn't realize that what they were hearing was likely a symptom of a neurological condition, possibly spasmodic dysphonia, a disorder that affects the muscles of the vocal cords. To outsiders, it sounded strange, even animalistic. But to those who listened closely, it was a language of its own, one that spoke through emotion rather than grammar. Lorraine, quieter but expressive, communicated in gestures and short phrases. Her eyes carried a mixture of confusion and deep sadness. And then there was Timmy, who, though intellectually limited, often appeared the most socially aware of the group. His drawings, his love of coloring books, and his fascination with names and letters became a small glimpse into his world, structured, repetitive, but comforting. Isolation as a way of life. Psychologists often say that human development depends on social exposure, language, interaction, education, stimulation. For the Whittakers, those experiences were limited almost entirely to family. The result was a self-contained world, one where behaviors, communication styles, and even perceptions of reality were shaped by the same few people, generation after generation. There are whispers of inbreeding within their family history, though few details are publicly confirmed. What is clear, however, is that genetic limitations, isolation, and poverty intersected to create a lineage defined by struggle. Without access to consistent education, healthcare, or community integration, the Whittakers were left to survive on their own terms, and they did for decades. Their world was small but consistent. The porch was their living room, the yard their social circle, the mountains their walls. They weren't aware of the world beyond, and the world beyond wasn't aware of them, until the camera showed up. The arrival of the camera. When Mark Lyda's Soft White Underbelly crew arrived, it was with curiosity, perhaps even compassion. He wanted to tell human stories, to give a face to the forgotten. But when he met the Whittakers, even he admitted he wasn't prepared for what he found. Their home felt like a world frozen in time. The smell of wood smoke, dogs barking at unseen visitors, siblings who both welcomed and feared outsiders. And yet, despite all of that, there was warmth, a sense of family that transcended words. Lyda described how neighbors warned him not to go, saying the family was dangerous, unpredictable, or unstable. But what he found instead was something heartbreakingly human. They weren't monsters. They weren't threats. They were simply people who had adapted to a life of isolation and had survived in their own way. Still, once the footage went live, the reactions were split. Some viewers were deeply moved, donating money, clothes, and food to help the family. Others accused the filmmaker of exploitation, of turning disability and poverty into spectacle. It felt like we were looking at people from another world, one commenter wrote. But the truth is, they're just from a world we've chosen to ignore. That sentence captured the essence of what made the Whittaker story so powerful and so controversial. The internet's mirror. Why were millions of people drawn to the Whittakers? Was it compassion or voyeurism? Part of it, experts say, comes from human curiosity about the unfamiliar. In psychology, this phenomenon is known as moral distance. People often become fascinated by lives so far removed from their own that they feel both empathy and discomfort. Watching the Whittakers offered a glimpse into a version of humanity unfiltered. No masks, no social polish, just raw existence. There was also a sense of redemption. Viewers wanted to help. Donations poured in, fundraisers were organized, and fans claimed they wanted to give them a better life. But as the money flowed and cameras returned, questions began to rise. What exactly was being fixed? Could you really change a life shaped by generations of isolation? Could you save people who might not even understand what the world expected of them? Betty, the matriarch of chaos and care. Then there was Betty, the family's matriarch, and the only one who truly bridged the gap between the Whittakers and the outside world. Strong-willed, outspoken, and protective, Betty became both the family's caretaker and, in the eyes of many, their biggest source of controversy. She handled donations, spoke for the family, and tried to manage their growing fame. But as the spotlight grew brighter, so did scrutiny. Some accused her of mismanaging funds, of controlling her siblings, of not doing enough to improve their living conditions. Others saw her differently, as a woman doing the best she could in impossible circumstances. Betty didn't ask for fame, one supporter said. She's just trying to keep her family together. Whether you saw her as a flawed caregiver or a devoted protector depended largely on how you viewed the entire family. Were the Whittakers victims of neglect or survivors of circumstance? The psychological paradox. At the core of the Whittaker story lies a paradox that still divides viewers today. The tension between compassion and curiosity. When people watched them, they weren't just observing a family. They were confronting their own discomfort about difference. The Whittakers represented something most of society tries to avoid: the limits of progress, the failures of a system, and a haunting reminder that not everyone gets the same chances. From a psychological perspective, this fascination isn't new. Humans are drawn to extremes, the extraordinary, the unfamiliar, the other. But that fascination can also dehumanize. It turns lives into symbols, suffering into spectacle. For the Whittakers, that meant living in a world where people cared about them deeply, but also didn't truly know them. Resilience in the face of judgment. What the world often overlooked was the resilience at the heart of the Whittaker family. Despite poverty, isolation, and ridicule, they built their own form of happiness. They laughed. They shared meals. They took care of one another. Their way of living might not fit modern ideals, but it worked for them. When asked once about how they survived without all the conveniences of city life, Betty simply said, "We got each other. That's enough." That single sentence carried the weight of generations, and it's the one truth that cuts through every criticism. For all their perceived strangeness, the Whittakers reflected something deeply human: the instinct to hold on to what little you have, especially when it's all you've ever known. The world's obsession with them wasn't just about difference, it was about reflection. People weren't just watching them, they were confronting themselves. What does it mean to be normal? What does it mean to survive? And why are we so fascinated by people who live outside the boundaries we call civilization? The answers lie not just in the Whittaker story, but in what their story revealed about us. How do you feel when you see the Whittakers' life? Do you feel empathy, shock, or curiosity? Comment below, because this story isn't just about them. It's about all of us. The Whittaker family story isn't just about poverty or fame or even the moral debate around exposure. It's about the long, silent consequences of isolation. When you peel back the layers of viral videos, internet arguments, and emotional reactions, what's left is a psychological portrait that stretches back decades. A living case study of what happens when a family lives generation after generation with almost no contact with the outside world. This is not fiction. This is real human psychology in action, raw, painful, and deeply revealing. The roots of isolation. To understand the Whittakers, you have to understand where they come from, not just geographically, but socially. Odd, West Virginia is not a town of opportunity. It's a place where time moves slowly, where work is hard to come by, and where family ties can be both a blessing and a prison. In many Appalachian communities, isolation is a way of life. It's not necessarily chosen, it's inherited. The Whittakers' isolation didn't begin with Ray, Lorraine, or Timmy. It started generations back, when limited access to education, healthcare, and mobility slowly shrank their world. As the years passed, those limitations became normal. The further society moved forward, the more the Whittakers were left behind. When people watched them online, what they saw wasn't just poverty. They were looking at the psychological residue of social abandonment. For decades, the family had little to no access to professional help. No therapists, no schools equipped for special education, no social workers trained to support people with cognitive disabilities. Instead, survival became the only skill they needed. And when survival is all you know, everything else, hygiene, education, ambition, becomes secondary. How isolation shapes the mind. In psychology, isolation isn't just physical. It's cognitive, emotional, and generational. When people live without social exposure or communication with the outside world, their thought patterns start to form loops, cycles of behavior and understanding that reinforce themselves. In the case of the Whittakers, that isolation became self-sustaining. They learned communication from one another, not from society. Their expressions, their sounds, even the way they moved through the world were shaped by a small, closed environment. It's not odd, it's adaptive. It's how the brain adjusts to its surroundings when those surroundings are all it knows. Lorraine's childlike gestures and Ray's distinct vocalizations are more than quirks. They're a language, the language of survival in isolation. When people judged or mocked them for it, what they didn't realize was that this was the family's form of connection. They developed their own form of understanding because the rest of the world never offered one. The cognitive window that never opened. Developmental psychology shows that language and social understanding are most flexible in early childhood. By around age 6, those pathways begin to close if they aren't stimulated. For children growing up in secluded environments, this means that communication, empathy, and problem-solving skills often develop in limited ways, and once those limits set in, they're hard to undo. That's why the Whitakers situation feels almost frozen in time. Their minds adapted to the environment they had. And once that adaptation solidified, the outside world became almost incomprehensible. It wasn't that they chose not to learn or grow. It's that their brains wired themselves around the only world they knew. You can see this in Timmy's repetitive behavior, drawing names, reciting words, fixating on patterns. Psychologists call this a comfort loop, a coping mechanism used by individuals with intellectual disabilities or developmental trauma to create predictability. In an unpredictable world, repetition becomes control. And for Ray, whose vocal cords produce sounds more like barks than speech, this wasn't just communication failure. It was neurological adaptation. His brain, deprived of language stimulation during key years, developed alternative ways to express needs and emotions. To him, it made sense. To the world, it sounded strange. But to his family, it was familiar. Empathy versus exploitation. When millions of people first saw the Whittakers on screen, the immediate reaction was a mix of fascination and pity. Some wanted to donate, others wanted to rescue them. But behind every comment of "they need help" lies a deeper question. Help from what? And help into what? Would thrusting them into mainstream society make them better or destroy the fragile balance they built? Experts in community psychology often point out that isolation, while harmful, can also create stability for people with certain cognitive or psychological limitations. Their routines, however unconventional, give structure to their lives. In the Whittakers' case, their home, their porch, and their shared environment were their comfort zone. When outsiders tried to intervene, that stability shattered. When Patrick and Eric, two content creators who became entangled in the Whittakers' story, started filming more frequently, conflict quickly followed. Accusations about money, manipulation, and exploitation erupted online. But underneath all the drama, one uncomfortable truth remained. Everyone wanted a piece of the story, and few stopped to ask how that story might affect the people at its center. The power of exposure. Psychologically, exposure can be both healing and harmful. When a private life becomes public, especially a life built on isolation, it creates what experts call cognitive dissonance. The family begins to see themselves through the eyes of others for the first time, and often that reflection is painful. The Whittakers were suddenly aware that the world saw them as different. Before the cameras, they weren't comparing themselves to anyone. They were just living. But now, millions of people online were dissecting their every gesture, word, and movement. Imagine living your whole life thinking your world was normal, and then one day, the entire internet tells you it isn't. That's not just a social shock. It's a psychological earthquake. Generational trauma and the weight of legacy. Isolation doesn't just affect individuals. It embeds itself into families like an invisible thread, pulling each generation into the same patterns. Psychologists refer to this as transgenerational transmission of trauma. Essentially, the stress and limitations of one generation become the foundation of the next. In the Whittakers' case, that means the emotional struggles of the parents, shame, fear, distrust of outsiders, became part of how their children learned to survive. It explains why even when help was offered, it was often rejected or misunderstood. To them, outsiders had always represented judgment, not safety. Betty, the family's matriarch, often embodied this paradox. Protective to a fault, she kept people close but also pushed them away. Her love for her siblings was real, but it came from a place of fear that they'd be taken, exposed, or misunderstood. Ironically, that same fear may have helped keep them isolated for so long. The human instinct to judge what we don't understand. The internet's obsession with the Whittakers revealed something uncomfortable about human nature. We are fascinated by what challenges our definition of normal. But that fascination often hides judgment. Comments on videos ranged from compassion to cruelty. Some viewers expressed heartbreak, others disgust. But both reactions stem from the same root: discomfort. When confronted with lives that exist outside our framework of logic or progress, we project our own expectations onto them. We say things like, they need to be rescued, or they should be in care, without considering that our version of help might feel like harm to them. The truth is, we don't know how to process difference, especially when it doesn't fit neatly into our moral or cultural understanding of what a good life looks like. The paradox of resilience. Here's the part that few talk about. The Whittakers survived. Despite everything, the isolation, the ridicule, the poverty, they lived, and they did it together. That's resilience in its purest form. In psychology, resilience doesn't always look like success. It doesn't mean thriving, achieving, or rising above. Sometimes it simply means continuing to exist, to wake up every day and keep going in a world that was never designed for you. The Whittakers did that, and they did it as a family. They found joy in simplicity. They loved one another fiercely. And even if their lives didn't meet modern standards of progress, they found comfort in familiarity, a form of survival that deserves as much respect as any story of triumph. A mirror to the world. Ultimately, the Whittakers' story says as much about us as it does about them. It exposes our curiosity, our compassion, and our discomfort. It forces us to look at how we define humanity and whether that definition truly includes everyone. When we watched them, we were not just seeing the consequences of isolation. We were seeing the limits of our own empathy. How do you view isolation now? As tragedy or as adaptation? Do you think the world helped the Whittakers or hurt them by watching? Share your thoughts below. Your voice matters here. When the first soft white underbelly video featuring the Whittakers went viral, it seemed like a miracle. Millions of people watched, shared, and commented, moved by what they saw as a raw glimpse into forgotten America. There were tears, prayers, and an outpouring of financial support. For a brief moment, it felt like the world cared. But what started as compassion quickly twisted into conflict. As money, attention, and ego entered the picture, the Whittakers became more than a family. They became a brand. And with that came chaos. The rise of the Whittaker economy. Within months of the first viral video, donations began pouring in. Viewers wanted to help. They sent money, clothes, food, and more through GoFundMe pages, Cash App links, and even handwritten letters with cash tucked inside. What no one realized was that there was no structure, no official organization or family representative with the training or understanding to manage that kind of support. Instead, the Whittakers' newfound fame became a free-for-all. Filmmaker Mark Lyda remained the most visible figure associated with the family, often stating publicly that he gave them money directly and covered some of their expenses. But outside of that, several others, local acquaintances, online supporters, and self-proclaimed managers, started claiming to act on behalf of the Whittakers. Two of the most controversial figures were Eric Carroll and Patrick Rohr, both of whom began producing their own YouTube videos with the family. At first, they were seen as helpers, people bringing food, cleaning supplies, and comfort to a struggling family. But over time, questions began to rise. Who was really benefiting, and where was the money going? When generosity meets greed. By late 2023, whispers began spreading online that thousands of dollars in donations were unaccounted for. The family's YouTube channel, which had gained massive traction thanks to Eric's editing and uploads, was rumored to be bringing in anywhere from $30,000 to $50,000 per month in ad revenue. The understanding, according to those close to the family, was that the funds would be split three ways: Eric, Patrick, and the Whittakers. But when the YouTube checks arrived, that agreement allegedly fell apart. Patrick claimed he hadn't been paid. Betty, the family's matriarch, reportedly saw only a fraction of the money, and fans began accusing Eric of pocketing the rest. Eric denied any wrongdoing, insisting that he had used his portion to cover taxes and production expenses. But by then, the damage was done. The comment sections exploded with anger. How could anyone profit off their pain? One user wrote. In the eyes of the internet, compassion had turned to exploitation, and the once unifying story of empathy had fractured into a bitter war of blame. The toll on the family. While outsiders argued over ethics and earnings, the Whittakers themselves seemed to spiral deeper into instability. Reports surfaced that Betty had lost contact with several family members after Adult Protective Services intervened. Some claimed that Lorraine, Timmy, and Ray were moved into protective care, while Betty was left behind, confused and alone. The internet speculated endlessly. Had the state taken them away because of neglect? Or had the media exposure itself prompted authorities to act? Either way, the family that once sat together on that now famous porch was separated. The irony is haunting. The very attention that was meant to help may have been what tore them apart. The public turns on itself. The once united Whittaker community, online, fans who came together to support the family, began to split into factions. On Facebook groups and YouTube comment threads, heated debates erupted daily. Some defended Mark Lyda and his work, calling him a hero for shining a light. Others accused him of turning tragedy into profit. One user wrote, "You can't film people who can't consent and then call it compassion. That's not help, that's exploitation." Another fired back, "If Mark hadn't filmed them, no one would even know they exist. At least now they got help and recognition." This moral tug-of-war became its own phenomenon. The Whittakers had not only divided their own family, but also divided the world watching them. It became less about them and more about us. What kind of society we've become when suffering turns into content. The ethics of exposure. This story forces a question many still avoid. When does storytelling become exploitation? Documentary ethics have always walked a fine line. The filmmaker's job is to reveal truth. But what happens when the subjects of that truth cannot fully understand or consent to their portrayal? In the Whittakers' case, the balance was especially fragile. Their disabilities limited their comprehension of the internet scale. They couldn't possibly know that millions of strangers were watching, analyzing, and judging their every move. Yet, those images were shared globally, monetized, and dissected. Mark Lyda defended his work by emphasizing that he paid the family and raised awareness about their conditions. But to some mental health professionals, it raised red flags about power imbalance and dignity. It's a debate that doesn't have easy answers, because both truths can coexist. The exposure did bring help. It also brought pain. When empathy turns into entertainment. One of the most disturbing elements of the Whittaker phenomenon is how easily empathy morphed into entertainment. Videos featuring the family routinely hit millions of views. Reaction videos multiplied. Memes and TikToks featuring clips of Ray's voice or Lorraine's gestures spread across social platforms, often without context or compassion. What started as a story of awareness became viral currency. Psychologically, this shift is known as compassion fatigue. When people are repeatedly exposed to tragedy online, they begin to desensitize. The suffering becomes spectacle. The empathy that once felt genuine turns into passive consumption. It's not that viewers stop caring. It's that they got used to caring. And once that happens, people start to treat real lives like episodes in a never-ending show. The collapse of compassion. By the time state authorities stepped in, the internet's empathy had already fractured. Those who once prayed for Betty now mocked her for bad decisions. Those who once adored Ray and Timmy began demanding updates like they were influencers, not human beings. This is the digital paradox. We connect deeply, but briefly. We care intensely, but inconsistently. For the Whittakers, this meant that their 15 minutes of fame came at an immeasurable cost. Their privacy, their peace, and perhaps their family unity. Mark, Lyda, Eric, Patrick, and countless others moved on to new projects, but the family stayed behind, still living with the consequences of that exposure. Their house was quieter, their porch emptier, their story unfinished. The deeper human question. At the heart of the Whittaker story lies one of the oldest questions in psychology and philosophy alike. What do we owe each other? Do we owe truth, even when it hurts? Do we owe protection, even when it silences someone's story? Do we owe understanding, even when it makes us uncomfortable? The Whittaker saga asks all three at once. Perhaps they were victims, perhaps survivors, perhaps both. But above all, they were human, and their humanity got lost in the noise. The mirror of modern compassion. Every time we click on a video, every time we share a link or write a comment, we're participating in something bigger than we realize. The Whittakers didn't choose the spotlight. We put them there. And in doing so, we also revealed ourselves, our hunger for emotion, our discomfort with difference, and our struggle to define what help really means. Some will say they were exploited. Others will say they were saved. But the truth, as always, lives somewhere in between, in a messy, uncomfortable space where empathy meets reality. How do you feel about the Whittakers' fame? Do you believe they were helped, harmed, or both? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about what real compassion should look like. The story of the Whittakers has moved through every phase imaginable. Discovery, fascination, controversy, and heartbreak. But what remains now, after the lights have dimmed and the cameras have gone, is reflection. It's not just about them anymore. It's about what they revealed about family, compassion, and the fragile humanity we all share. The silence after the storm. Today, the Whittaker house in Odd, West Virginia, stands quieter than before. The laughter, the chaos, the constant hum of visitors and filmmakers has faded. For the first time in years, the family is not the subject of global attention. Some say Betty still sits on the porch sometimes, rocking slowly, speaking softly to the dogs that wander by. She has always been the anchor, both the protector and the lightning rod. Many blame her for the family's troubles, but few stop to see the reality. She carried the weight of generations. With Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy reportedly in state care or assisted living, the home that once symbolized the family's endurance now feels like a memory, a shell of what once was. And yet, even in that silence, the Whittakers' story continues to echo. The psychology of the public eye. When the Whittakers' story exploded online, the public reaction revealed as much about our collective psyche as it did about theirs. People were drawn in by empathy, but stayed for something darker. Curiosity, even morbid fascination. In a world obsessed with curated perfection, flawless influencers, scripted reality shows, polished lives, the Whittakers were raw truth. They were unfiltered, untrained, and unaffected by social norms. And that, in itself, was revolutionary. But that authenticity came with a cost. We often say we want the truth, but what happens when the truth is uncomfortable? When it forces us to see poverty, disability, and isolation up close? For many, the Whittakers were a window into something we like to ignore, that entire families can slip through the cracks of society and still exist right here in modern America. Their presence reminded us that progress doesn't reach everyone, and sometimes the people who need help the most are the ones least equipped to ask for it. The question of dignity. What does dignity look like in a world of viral videos? For the Whittakers, dignity wasn't about fame or comfort. It was about family. It was about existing together, however imperfectly. They didn't ask for cameras, nor did they fully understand the power those cameras had. But once their lives became public, their dignity became currency. People debated their worth, their choices, their capacity, all from behind screens. And yet, in the quiet moments of those original interviews, the way Lorraine smiled at her brother, the way Ray pointed proudly at the family dogs, the way Betty stood her ground, there was something deeply human, something defiant. They were not ashamed of who they were. The shame belonged to us for turning their lives into debate instead of compassion. The uncomfortable truth about compassion. If there's one thing the Whittaker saga exposed, it's how fragile our empathy can be. When a story first broke, compassion was everywhere. Strangers from across the globe donated, commented, and shared messages of support. But as time went on, compassion began to fracture, replaced by outrage, finger-pointing, and ego. The truth is, modern empathy has a short attention span. We love the idea of helping until it becomes complicated. We celebrate people's stories until those stories no longer make us feel good. The Whittaker story asks something harder of us, to stay compassionate after the camera's turned off, to care about dignity, not just drama, to value humanity, not just virality. What they taught us without speaking. Ray never gave a speech. Lorraine never wrote a book. Timmy never stood on a stage. And yet, they taught us lessons that most of us will never forget. They showed us what resilience looks like when the world forgets you. They showed us that family doesn't have to be perfect to be real. They reminded us that compassion without understanding is just pity, and pity helps no one. Every time we watch them, on that old porch, surrounded by clutter and dogs, laughing one moment and silent the next, we were witnessing something rare, unfiltered existence. They weren't performing. They weren't pretending. They were simply being. And that, in a world built on pretense, was profound. A reflection on us. The Whittakers' story became a mirror. In them, we saw our biases, our empathy, and our discomfort. They made us question what it means to live a good life, what it means to be normal, and whether normal even matters. We spend so much time chasing perfection that we forget survival in itself is an act of courage. The Whittakers didn't have much, but they had each other. They endured ridicule, misunderstanding, and exploitation, and yet they continued to show up, together, day after day. Their resilience challenges our assumptions about success. It forces us to rethink what we value: money, image, intellect, compared to loyalty, endurance, and unconditional love. The legacy of the Whittakers. The Whittakers will likely never fade completely from public memory. Their story will remain an uncomfortable chapter in internet history, one filled with compassion, controversy, and moral questions that still have no simple answers. But maybe that's what makes their legacy powerful. It reminds us that humanity isn't always pretty, progress isn't always linear, and empathy isn't always easy. Maybe the lesson is this: to see people not as spectacles, but as souls. To approach stories like theirs not with pity, but with humility. And to remember that even in the most forgotten corners of the world, love and resilience still live in families like the Whittakers. How do you feel after learning their story? Do you see tragedy or strength, isolation or survival? Share your thoughts in the comments because understanding begins with conversation.